Tonight, we enter dangerous territory. Not the kind that requires armor or weapons, but the kind that demands you sit still and face what you've been running from since 2017. We're diving into the silent rebellion, that quiet revolution happening inside people who've finally gotten tired of performing their own healing for an audience of ghosts. You know who you are. You're the one scrolling through self-help content at 2 a.m., wondering why nothing sticks. You're the person who can quote Jung, but still texts your ex when Mercury's in retrograde. You're spiritually woke and emotionally broke, simultaneously enlightened and exhausted, carrying wisdom in your head while your heart still operates like it's dodging emotional landmines from 2008. Here's tonight's unholy trinity: projection, self-sabotage, and that voice in your head that sounds suspiciously like your mother's disapproval mixed with your father's emotional unavailability. We're talking about the stories you tell yourself about why you're stuck, why you're different, why healing happens to other people, but somehow skips your address like a delivery driver who can't find your emotional mailbox. Forget the just love yourself advice. Your version of self-love has trust issues and a tendency to ghostwrite its own rejection letters. You say you're ready for change, but your nervous system treats intimacy like a fire drill and commitment like a foreign language you learned in high school but never actually used. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, united by the universal experience of being emotionally sophisticated and psychologically messy at the same time. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Turn off notifications. Your anxiety doesn't need real-time updates. Make sure you're somewhere you can breathe without performing, think without editing, and feel without immediately trying to fix whatever comes up. Tonight, we're not in your bedroom or your living room. We're in the space between who you think you are and who you actually are when nobody's watching. The good news: your unconscious has been trying to get your attention through increasingly creative symptoms. The bad news: it's about as subtle as a fire alarm at 3 a.m. and twice as persistent. The interesting news: Jung figured out how to have a conversation with this part of yourself without needing a PhD in psychology or a trust fund for therapy. This content is for those of you who are exhausted from carrying wounds that have been dressed up as personality traits. You're tired of being the strong one, the wise one, the one who has it all figured out while secretly Googling how to stop feeling everything so intensely at midnight. You're done with spiritual bypassing that sounds profound, but leaves you feeling more isolated than before. You're ready for something real, something that doesn't require you to pretend you're not scared, angry, or heartbroken while attempting to manifest your way out of basic human emotions. Carl Jung once observed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he also understood something most self-help gurus conveniently forget. Becoming who you truly are requires sitting with who you've been running from. It means facing the parts of yourself you've been editing out of your story, the emotions you've been outsourcing to other people, and the shadows you've been projecting onto everyone else's behavior. Jung called it individuation, the process of integrating all parts of yourself, including the ones that make you uncomfortable at dinner parties. It's not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's not about eliminating your darkness. It's about learning to dance with it instead of pretending it doesn't exist while it quietly runs your life from the basement of your psyche. The silent rebellion begins when you stop trying to be the person you think you should be and start getting curious about who you actually are beneath the layers of adaptation, performance, and learned helplessness. It's the moment you realize that your emotional patterns aren't character flaws, they're information. Your triggers aren't weaknesses, they're doorways. Your resistance isn't failure, it's intelligence. But here's what nobody tells you about this process. It's not linear, it's not comfortable, and it definitely doesn't look like the Instagram version of personal growth. It looks like sitting with your discomfort instead of immediately trying to solve it. It looks like letting yourself feel angry without immediately apologizing for having emotions. It looks like setting boundaries without explaining yourself to death, or making it into a graduate-level dissertation on why you deserve basic respect. The silent rebellion is called silent because it happens in the space between stimulus and response, in the pause before you react from old patterns, in the breath you take before you choose your next move, based on who you're becoming, rather than who you've always been. It's the revolution that happens when you stop waiting for permission to exist as you are, stop apologizing for taking up space, and stop performing emotional labor for people who wouldn't recognize authentic connection if it sent them a formal invitation with RSVP instructions. Jung understood that the path to psychological freedom isn't about getting rid of your shadow. It's about bringing it into conscious relationship. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's your unclaimed power. It's the anger you were taught to swallow, the desires you were told were selfish, the parts of yourself you learned to hide to keep other people comfortable. The shadow contains not just your repressed darkness, but your repressed light. The brilliance you dimmed to fit in, the creativity you abandoned to be practical, the love you withheld to avoid being hurt. The first step in this silent rebellion is recognizing that your symptoms aren't random. That anxiety you feel before setting boundaries isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's your nervous system responding to the unfamiliar experience of prioritizing your own needs. That depression that hits when you're alone isn't evidence that you're broken. It's what happens when you finally stop running from yourself long enough to feel what you've been carrying. Your insomnia isn't just about sleep. It's about the parts of yourself that only feel safe coming out in the dark, when the world is quiet enough to hear your own thoughts without immediately having to explain them to someone else. Your restlessness isn't about needing more stimulation. It's about needing more space to exist without having to justify your existence. The silent rebellion asks you to stop treating your emotional life like a problem to be solved and start treating it like intelligence to be listened to. Your emotions aren't obstacles to your growth. They're the very mechanism through which growth happens. Fear isn't your enemy. It's your protector asking if you're sure about this next step. Anger isn't your weakness. It's your boundary system letting you know something isn't right. Sadness isn't your failure. It's your heart's way of releasing what no longer serves you. Jung called this process active imagination, the practice of consciously engaging with the unconscious material that emerges in dreams, fantasies, and the spaces between thoughts. It's not about analyzing your dreams to death or turning every emotion into a metaphor. It's about learning to have a conversation with the parts of yourself that have been trying to get your attention through increasingly dramatic symptoms. Active imagination begins with the radical act of listening to yourself without immediately trying to fix, change, or improve what you hear. It's the practice of treating your inner world like a landscape to be explored rather than a problem to be solved. When anxiety arises, instead of immediately reaching for a technique to make it go away, you might ask, "What are you trying to tell me? What do you need me to know? What would happen if I listened to you instead of fighting you?" This isn't about indulging every emotion or acting on every impulse. It's about developing a conscious relationship with your inner world so that your emotions become information rather than emergencies. When you know how to listen to your anger, it can tell you about your boundaries. When you know how to be with your fear, it can tell you about your values. When you know how to feel your sadness, it can tell you about your capacity for love. The silent rebellion is also about recognizing the difference between healing and performance. Healing happens in the spaces between words, in the moments, when you choose presence over productivity, in the decision to feel what you're feeling, without immediately trying to spiritual bypass your way out of it. Performance is when you use healing language to avoid actually healing, when you collect insights like trophies, while your emotional patterns remain unchanged, when you become so good at talking about your growth that you forget to actually grow. Real healing is often boring. It's choosing the same boundary for the 100th time until it becomes natural. It's sitting with discomfort until you realize you can survive it. It's disappointing people who are used to you being available for their drama while you learn to be available for your own life. It's the unglamorous work of showing up for yourself in ways that nobody else will witness or applaud. Jung understood that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires what he called holding the tension of opposites. This means learning to exist in the space between your desire for connection and your need for autonomy, between your longing for security and your need for growth, between your wish to be understood and your responsibility to understand yourself. Most people collapse this tension by choosing one side or the other. They become either completely independent or completely dependent, either emotionally open or emotionally closed, either trusting everyone or trusting no one. The silent rebellion asks you to develop the capacity to hold both truths simultaneously, to be vulnerable and boundaried, connected and autonomous, open and discerning. This requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to bridge conscious and unconscious, thinking and feeling, individual and collective. The transcendent function isn't something you achieve, it's something you practice. It's the moment-to-moment choice to stay present with complexity instead of collapsing into simplicity, to remain curious instead of becoming certain, to keep learning instead of deciding you already know. The silent rebellion is ultimately about reclaiming your right to exist as you are without apology, explanation, or performance. It's about recognizing that your sensitivity isn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be honored. Your intensity isn't too much. It's exactly what the world needs from someone willing to feel deeply in a culture that encourages emotional numbness. Your questions aren't signs of confusion, they're signs of intelligence refusing to accept easy answers to complex problems. This rebellion begins in the space between your thoughts, in the pause before you react, in the moment when you choose to respond from your authentic self rather than your adapted self. It's the decision to stop performing your healing for other people and start actually healing for yourself. It's the choice to stop waiting for permission to be who you are and start giving yourself that permission, moment by moment, breath by breath. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but he also understood that this terror is the gateway to freedom. When you stop running from yourself, you stop attracting people and situations that mirror your own self-rejection. When you stop fighting your shadow, you stop projecting it onto everyone else. When you stop trying to be perfect, you become real. The silent rebellion isn't about becoming someone new. It's about excavating who you've always been beneath the layers of conditioning, trauma, and adaptation. It's about recognizing that your wound is also your gift, your sensitivity is also your superpower, and your depth is also your contribution to a world that desperately needs people willing to feel everything and still choose love. The process of self-excavation requires what Jung called the courage of imperfection, the willingness to be authentically yourself, even when you're not sure who that is, even when you're changing, even when you're contradictory. It's the recognition that you don't have to have yourself figured out in order to be yourself. This courage develops through practice, through small acts of authenticity that help you realize you can survive other people's disappointment. Maybe you say no to a social invitation when you're tired, instead of forcing yourself to go. Maybe you express a different opinion instead of automatically agreeing. Maybe you ask for what you need instead of hoping someone will guess. Each time you choose authenticity over approval and survive the experience, you build evidence that you can be yourself and still be okay. You discover that most people's disapproval is not actually dangerous, that conflict is not actually catastrophic, that being disliked by some people is not actually devastating. The archaeology of self-deception involves excavating these layers of learned responses, these protective strategies that once served you but now limit you. You begin to see how you learn to please people to feel safe, how you learn to hide your needs to avoid rejection, how you learn to minimize yourself to make others comfortable. This excavation is not about blaming anyone for how you learned to adapt. Your adaptations were intelligent responses to the environments you found yourself in. But recognizing them as adaptations rather than truth gives you the power to choose whether to continue them or try something different. The silent rebellion is about recognizing that you are not your adaptations. You are not your people-pleasing patterns, your self-minimizing habits, or your conflict avoidance strategies. These are things you learn to do, not who you are. And anything that was learned can be unlearned, can be questioned, can be consciously chosen rather than unconsciously repeated. Jung understood that this process of conscious choice-making is what transforms human beings from reactive creatures into responsive beings. Instead of automatically reacting from conditioning, you develop the capacity to pause, assess and choose your response based on who you want to be in each moment, rather than who you've always been. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen through dramatic revelations or peak experiences. It happens through the accumulation of small conscious choices over time. It happens through the daily practice of choosing presence over distraction, authenticity over performance, consciousness over reactivity. The silent rebellion is not a destination, but a practice, not an achievement, but a way of being, not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. It's the ongoing choice to remain curious about yourself, to stay open to growth, to keep excavating who you are beneath who you've learned to be. Most people get stuck in this process because they turn their healing into another form of self-improvement, another project to perfect, another way to prove they're worthy of love and acceptance. They collect therapeutic insights like Pokemon cards and use spiritual language to avoid the messy reality of actually changing their patterns. They become professional patients or enlightened beings who somehow manage to be both deeply wise and completely stuck in the same emotional loops they were in 5 years ago. The shadow of the healing journey is that it can become another form of narcissism, another way to focus obsessively on yourself while avoiding the vulnerability of actually connecting with other people. You can become so good at analyzing your patterns that you forget to break them, so skilled at understanding your trauma that you use it as an excuse to avoid intimacy, so proficient at self-awareness that you mistake insight for transformation. Jung called this spiritual inflation, the tendency to identify with the wisdom you've gained rather than embodying it. It's when you become attached to being the person who's done the work, who's aware, who's conscious, who's evolved. It's a subtle but deadly trap, because it uses the language of growth to maintain the ego's sense of specialness and separation. The antidote to spiritual inflation is what Jung called active suffering, the willingness to feel your pain without making it into a story about how special your pain is. It's the capacity to sit with your wounds without turning them into your identity. It's the practice of letting your heart break without making it into a mythology about how much you've endured. Active suffering means feeling your emotions without immediately trying to understand them, process them, or learn from them. Sometimes pain is just pain. Sometimes sadness is just sadness. Sometimes fear is just fear. Not everything needs to be a spiritual lesson or a psychological insight. Sometimes the most healing thing you can do is simply feel what you're feeling without trying to make it mean anything. This is particularly challenging for people who have turned their healing journey into their identity. If you've spent years telling yourself and others that you're in recovery, in therapy, on a spiritual path doing the work, then what happens when you're just living your life? What happens when you're not processing or growing or transforming, but simply existing as an ordinary human being with ordinary problems and ordinary joys? The silent rebellion includes the radical act of being ordinary. It's the recognition that enlightenment isn't about transcending your humanity, but about fully embodying it. It's not about becoming someone special, but about becoming authentically yourself, which includes being sometimes petty, sometimes scared, sometimes angry, sometimes confused, and sometimes just tired of thinking about your own psychology. Jung understood that individuation isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. Wholeness includes your pettiness, your blind spots, your inconsistencies, and your limitations. It includes the parts of yourself that you'd rather edit out of your story, the emotions you wish you didn't have, and the patterns you thought you'd outgrown but keep showing up in new forms. True psychological maturity is being able to hold all of this without either identifying with it or rejecting it. It's the capacity to notice your pettiness without becoming petty, to feel your fear without becoming fearful, to recognize your patterns without becoming your patterns. This requires what Jung called the observing ego, the part of yourself that can witness your experience without being overwhelmed by it. The observing ego isn't about dissociation or emotional detachment. It's about developing the capacity to be present with your experience without being consumed by it. It's like being able to watch a movie while knowing you're watching a movie. You can be moved by the story without forgetting that you're not actually in the story. This capacity develops through practice, through the daily choice to pause between stimulus and response, to breathe before reacting, to feel before thinking. It develops through the willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately trying, to fix it, change it, or understand it. It develops through the radical act of being present with what is, rather than constantly trying to create what should be. The silent rebellion is also about recognizing the difference between spiritual bypassing and spiritual integration. Spiritual bypassing is using spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with psychological reality. It's when you use forgiveness to avoid feeling anger, when you use surrender to avoid taking responsibility, when you use acceptance to avoid setting boundaries. Spiritual integration is the opposite. It's using spiritual principles to more fully engage with psychological reality. It's using mindfulness to become more aware of your patterns, not to transcend them. It's using compassion to feel your pain more fully, not to avoid it. It's using wisdom to make better choices, not to pretend you don't have to make choices. The difference between bypassing and integration is often subtle but crucial. Bypassing feels like relief. Integration feels like expansion. Bypassing gives you a temporary escape from your problems. Integration gives you a permanent expansion of your capacity to handle problems. Bypassing makes you feel special. Integration makes you feel real. Jung's approach to individuation was fundamentally about integration rather than transcendence. He wasn't interested in helping people escape their humanity. He was interested in helping them embrace it fully. He understood that the goal isn't to eliminate your shadow, but to bring it into conscious relationship, not to get rid of your ego, but to right-size it, not to transcend your personality, but to inhabit it authentically. This means that the silent rebellion isn't about becoming someone you're not. It's about stopping the exhausting process of pretending to be someone you're not. It's about giving up the performance of being spiritual, healthy, evolved, or awakened, and simply being human, fully, messily, authentically human. The shadow economy of emotional labor refers to all the invisible work you do to manage other people's emotions, to keep peace in relationships, to avoid conflict or rejection. This labor is called shadow work because it's often unconscious. You don't realize you're doing it, and neither do the people benefiting from it. This emotional labor shows up in countless ways: automatically saying yes when you want to say no, minimizing your needs to make others comfortable, taking responsibility for other people's feelings, explaining yourself to death when setting boundaries, apologizing for existing, changing the subject when things get uncomfortable, and performing happiness when you're actually struggling. The shadow economy operates on the assumption that your value as a person depends on how useful you are to others, how much you can give, how little you need, how easy you are to be around. It's a system where your worth is measured by your productivity, your niceness, your compliance, your ability to make other people feel good about themselves. Jung understood that this economy is built on a fundamental lie, the lie that you must earn love through performance, that acceptance is conditional on being who others need you to be, that your authentic self is somehow not enough. This lie creates a split between your true self and your performing self, between who you are and who you think you should be. The silent rebellion involves recognizing this split and choosing integration over performance. It means acknowledging that your performing self was an intelligent adaptation to environments where authenticity felt dangerous, but that you no longer need to maintain this performance in relationships where safety and acceptance are possible. This recognition often brings up what Jung called the terror of authenticity, the fear that if people see who you really are, they'll reject you. This fear is often based on early experiences where authenticity was met with punishment, rejection, or abandonment. The terror is real because the early experiences were real, but Jung understood that this terror is often based on outdated information. The relationships and environments that taught you to perform may no longer be present in your life. The people who couldn't handle your authenticity then may not be the people you're in relationship with now. The fear of rejection may be more about the past than the present. The silent rebellion asks you to update your information about what's safe and what's possible in your current relationships. It asks you to test whether the people in your life now can handle more of your authenticity than the people who taught you to perform. It asks you to discover whether the fear of rejection is based on current reality or historical conditioning. This testing happens gradually, through small experiments in authenticity. Maybe you share a feeling you would normally hide. Maybe you ask for something you would normally do without. Maybe you say no to something you would normally force yourself to do. These experiments give you new information about what's possible in your relationships. Sometimes you'll discover that people can handle more of your authenticity than you thought. Sometimes you'll discover that certain people really can't handle your authenticity, and you'll need to decide whether to limit your sharing with them or limit your investment in the relationship itself. The silent rebellion is not about being authentic with everyone in the same way. It's about developing the discernment to know who can handle what level of your authenticity, and choosing your level of sharing based on that discernment rather than on automatic patterns of performance or people-pleasing. Jung called this relational intelligence, the ability to read the emotional capacity of different relationships and adjust your sharing accordingly. It's not about being fake, it's about being appropriate. You can be authentic without being indiscriminate. You can be real without being careless. Relational intelligence also involves recognizing when you're in relationships that require too much performance and too little authenticity. These are relationships where you consistently feel like you have to edit yourself, where you can't share your real thoughts or feelings, where you feel accepted only for certain parts of yourself. The silent rebellion sometimes means ending or limiting these relationships, not because the other person is bad, but because the relationship dynamic doesn't support your growth toward wholeness. Sometimes people are in your life for a season, not a lifetime. Sometimes relationships that worked when you were performing yourself no longer work when you're being yourself. This can be one of the most challenging aspects of the individuation process, realizing that as you become more authentic, some relationships may no longer fit. People who are comfortable with your adapted self may be uncomfortable with your authentic self. People who benefited from your emotional labor may not support your boundaries. Jung understood that this relationship shifting is a natural part of growth. As you change, your relationship needs change. As you heal, you attract different kinds of connections. As you become more whole, you need relationships that can handle your wholeness, rather than just your adaptations. The silent rebellion is about trusting this process even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means disappointing people, even when it means being misunderstood. It's about recognizing that your job is not to remain the same to keep other people comfortable. Your job is to keep growing into who you're meant to be. This doesn't mean being careless with people's feelings or ending relationships impulsively. It means being honest about when relationships support your growth and when they don't, being clear about what you need from connections, and being willing to invest your energy in relationships that can handle your authenticity. The shadow economy of emotional labor also extends to your relationship with yourself. You may have learned to treat yourself the same way you treat others, constantly trying to fix yourself, improve yourself, make yourself more acceptable, more lovable, more worthy. The silent rebellion asks you to extend the same authenticity and acceptance to yourself that you're learning to express in relationships with others. It asks you to stop performing for yourself, stop trying to be who you think you should be, stop measuring your worth by your productivity or your progress. Jung understood that self-acceptance is not passive resignation, but active embrace. It's the recognition that you are worthy of love and acceptance exactly as you are, not because you're perfect, but because you're real. This doesn't mean you stop growing or changing. It means you grow and change from a place of self-love rather than self-rejection. The transition from self-improvement to self-acceptance is often the most challenging part of the individuation process because it requires giving up the hope that if you just work hard enough, you can become someone who doesn't need love and acceptance, someone who's so perfect that rejection is impossible. But Jung knew that this hope is actually a form of self-rejection disguised as self-improvement. It's the belief that who you are now is not enough, that you must become someone else to be worthy of love. The silent rebellion is about recognizing this belief as the lie it is and choosing to love yourself into wholeness rather than trying to perfect yourself into worthiness. The depth of Jung's insight becomes clearer when you realize that most emotional suffering comes not from having difficult emotions, but from having difficult emotions about having difficult emotions. You're not just angry, you're ashamed of being angry. You're not just sad, you're frustrated with yourself for being sad. You're not just afraid, you're angry at yourself for being afraid. This secondary layer of suffering is what Buddhism calls the second arrow. The pain you add to pain by judging your experience of pain. Jung understood this phenomenon and developed what he called the attitude of the observer, the capacity to witness your experience without immediately evaluating it as good or bad, right or wrong, spiritual or unspiritual. The attitude of the observer is different from dissociation because it includes compassion. You're not detaching from your experience. You're creating space around it. You're not numbing your emotions. You're giving them room to breathe. You're not avoiding your pain. You're approaching it with curiosity rather than judgment. This shift in attitude is often the beginning of real healing. When you stop fighting your anxiety, it often decreases. When you stop judging your depression, it often lifts. When you stop trying to fix your patterns, they often change on their own. Not because you're doing something to them, but because you're no longer adding resistance to what's already happening. Jung called this the healing power of attention, the recognition that consciousness itself is transformative. When you bring conscious awareness to unconscious patterns, they naturally begin to shift, not through force or effort, but through the simple act of being seen and acknowledged. This is why so many people find that their biggest breakthroughs happen not when they're trying to change, but when they're simply accepting what is. When you stop trying to be different and start being present with who you are, paradoxically, you often discover that you're already different than you thought you were. The frequency of authenticity operates on a completely different principle than the frequency of performance. Performance operates on scarcity, the belief that you must earn love, acceptance, and belonging through what you do rather than who you are. Authenticity operates on abundance, the recognition that you are inherently worthy of love, acceptance, and belonging simply because you exist. This shift from scarcity to abundance is not a mental concept, but an embodied experience. It's something you feel in your nervous system, in your breathing, in the way you hold your body, in the quality of your presence. When you're performing, your body is tense, your breathing is shallow, your attention is focused on managing other people's reactions. When you're authentic, your body is relaxed, your breathing is deep, your attention is focused on expressing your truth. The performance addiction is a real phenomenon that affects millions of people who learned early that their worth was conditional on their behavior. These are people who received love and attention for being good, smart, helpful, accomplished, or easy to be around, and received criticism, punishment, or withdrawal of love for being difficult, needy, emotional, or different. The addiction develops because performing does work, to a point. It does get you attention, approval, and a form of love, but it's conditional love, based on your behavior rather than your being. And like all addictions, it requires increasingly higher doses to achieve the same effect. You have to be better, more helpful, more accomplished, more selfless to maintain the same level of approval. Jung understood that this addiction is ultimately unsustainable because it's based on self-rejection. You're essentially saying, I'm not acceptable as I am, so I'll become someone else to get the love I need. But the love you receive is for your performance, not for you. So you never actually feel loved. You feel appreciated for your usefulness. The silent rebellion is about breaking this addiction by learning to distinguish between conditional love and unconditional love, between appreciation and acceptance, between being valued for what you do and being valued for who you are. This distinction is often difficult to make because performance addiction usually starts early, before you had the cognitive capacity to understand what was happening. You learned to perform love rather than receive love, to earn acceptance rather than expect it, to prove your worth rather than trust it. Breaking a performance addiction requires what Jung called reparenting yourself, learning to give yourself the unconditional love and acceptance that you didn't receive when you needed it most. This isn't about blaming your parents or caregivers. It's about taking responsibility for meeting your own emotional needs as an adult. Reparenting yourself means learning to comfort yourself when you're upset, instead of automatically trying to fix whatever upset you. It means celebrating your successes without needing external validation. It means setting boundaries without over-explaining or apologizing. It means honoring your feelings without immediately trying to change them. The process of reparenting often brings up what Jung called primal grief, the sadness about what you didn't receive when you most needed it. This grief is not self-pity, it's a necessary part of healing. You have to mourn what you didn't. Get before you can give it to yourself. This mourning process can be intense because it involves feeling the full impact of early deprivation. You might realize how much energy you've spent trying to earn what should have been freely given. You might feel angry about having to work so hard for basic acceptance. You might feel sad about all the times you hid your true self to avoid rejection. Jung understood that this grief is healing because it honors the reality of what happened, while creating space for something different to emerge. When you stop denying the impact of early conditioning, you can begin to make conscious choices about how you want to relate to yourself and others going forward. The frequency of authenticity requires developing what Jung called emotional sovereignty, the recognition that you are the ultimate authority on your own experience. No one else can tell you what you're feeling, what you need, what you want, or what's right for you. You may choose to consider other people's input, but the final decision about your life belongs to you. Emotional sovereignty is different from emotional independence. Independence suggests you don't need anything from anyone. Sovereignty suggests you can choose what you need and from whom, based on your own discernment rather than automatic patterns or external pressure. Developing emotional sovereignty often requires what Jung called reclaiming your projections, recognizing when you're giving other people authority over your emotional state and taking that authority back. This happens when you realize you've been making other people responsible for your happiness, your self-worth, your sense of safety, or your decision-making. Projection is a natural psychological process, but it becomes problematic when it's unconscious. When you're not aware that you're projecting, you become dependent on other people to regulate your emotions, validate your worth, or make your decisions. This creates what Jung called emotional codependency, relationships where both people are trying to get from the other what they need to give themselves. The silent rebellion involves recognizing your projections and consciously choosing to take back the authority you've been giving away. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or inconsiderate. It means taking responsibility for your own emotional state while remaining open to connection and influence from others. For example, if you've been making your partner responsible for your happiness, reclaiming this projection might mean learning to comfort yourself when you're upset, finding your own sources of joy and fulfillment, and choosing to share your happiness with your partner, rather than expecting them to create it for you. If you've been making your boss responsible for your self-worth, reclaiming this projection might mean recognizing your own value, independent of external feedback, setting boundaries around criticism, and choosing to excel in your work for your own satisfaction rather than just for approval. The frequency of authenticity also requires what Jung called energetic boundaries, the ability to maintain your own emotional state regardless of what's happening around you. This doesn't mean being unaffected by others. It means being able to feel what others are feeling without taking on their emotions as your own. Energetic boundaries are particularly important for sensitive people who tend to absorb other people's emotions unconsciously. These are people who walk into a room and immediately feel whatever the dominant emotion is, who have difficulty distinguishing between their own feelings and other people's feelings, who often feel overwhelmed in groups or crowds. Jung understood that sensitivity is not a weakness, but a gift that requires conscious management. Sensitive people often have access to subtle information about emotional dynamics, relationship patterns, and unspoken communication. But this gift becomes a burden when they don't know how to protect their own emotional space. Developing energetic boundaries involves learning to consciously choose what emotions you allow into your system and what emotions you deflect or transform. This isn't about becoming cold or unfeeling. It's about becoming discerning about emotional input. Techniques for maintaining energetic boundaries include visualizing protective barriers around your energy field, consciously breathing out emotions that don't belong to you, and regularly clearing your emotional space through meditation, time in nature, or other practices that help you return to your own center. The silent rebellion is about recognizing that you have the right to maintain your own emotional space, to choose what emotions you engage with, and to protect yourself from emotional overwhelm without feeling guilty about it. It's about understanding that caring for your own emotional well-being is not selfish, but necessary for your ability to be genuinely present and helpful to others. The frequency of authenticity also requires developing what Jung called the courage to be ordinary. This might sound contradictory in a culture that constantly pushes you to be special, exceptional, or extraordinary, but Jung understood that the pressure to be special is often another form of performance, another way of earning love and acceptance through achievement rather than being. The courage to be ordinary means being willing to have regular human experiences, being sometimes boring, sometimes average, sometimes unremarkable. It means not having to turn every experience into a spiritual lesson, every challenge into a growth opportunity, every emotion into insight. Sometimes you're just tired. Sometimes you're just having a bad day. Sometimes you're just being human without any deeper meaning attached to it. This courage is particularly challenging for people who have built their identity around being different, unique, or special. Maybe you've been the smart one, the spiritual one, the strong one, the creative one, the helper, the healer. These identities can become just as limiting as negative identities because they require you to maintain a certain image rather than simply being who you are in each moment. Jung understood that true individuation requires giving up all fixed identities, both positive and negative. You're not the person who has it all figured out, and you're not the person who's hopelessly lost. You're not the enlightened one, and you're not the broken one. You're simply yourself, moment by moment, changing and growing and being human. The frequency of authenticity operates on what Jung called present moment awareness. The recognition that authenticity is not a fixed state, but a dynamic process of staying true to whatever is real for you right now. This means you might be confident in one moment and insecure in the next, generous in one situation and boundaried in another, open in one relationship and closed in another. This dynamic authenticity requires giving up the need to be consistent in favor of being real. Consistency is often overrated because it can become another form of performance, another way of maintaining an image, rather than expressing truth. Real people are inconsistent because real life is complex and circumstances change. The silent rebellion includes the permission to be different in different contexts, to change your mind, to grow beyond your previous understanding of yourself, to contradict yourself when new information or experiences shift your perspective. It's about recognizing that growth often looks like inconsistency from the outside because you're integrating new parts of yourself that don't fit your previous self-concept. Jung also understood that authenticity requires what he called relational attunement, the ability to be genuinely yourself while also being responsive to the people and situations around you. This is different from people-pleasing because you're not changing who you are to make others comfortable. You're expressing who you are in ways that consider the context and the other person's capacity to receive it. For example, you might express anger differently with your best friend than with your grandmother, not because you're being fake, but because your grandmother might not have the emotional capacity to handle the full intensity of your anger while your best friend does. You're still being authentic. You're just being contextually appropriate in how you express your authenticity. Relational attunement also means recognizing when relationships don't support your authenticity and making conscious choices about how much of yourself to share in those relationships. You don't owe everyone access to all parts of yourself. You can be authentic without being indiscriminate. This discrimination requires developing what Jung called relational wisdom, the ability to read the emotional capacity of different relationships and share accordingly. Some people can handle your vulnerability, others can't. Some people can handle your intensity, Others get overwhelmed. Some people can handle your boundaries, others take them personally. Relational wisdom is not about judgment, it's about discernment. It's about recognizing that people have different capacities based on their own healing, their own conditioning, their own current life circumstances. This recognition allows you to be compassionate with people's limitations while also protecting your own need for authentic expression. The development of relational wisdom often requires what Jung called experimental authenticity, gradually testing how much of yourself you can safely share in different relationships. This might mean sharing a vulnerable feeling with someone and seeing how they respond, setting a boundary and noticing whether it's respected, expressing a different opinion, and observing whether there's space for disagreement. These experiments give you information about the emotional safety and capacity of your relationships. Sometimes you'll discover that people can handle more of your authenticity than you thought. Sometimes you'll discover that certain relationships have real limitations that you need to respect. The frequency of authenticity is ultimately about energy management. Performance drains your energy because you're constantly monitoring and adjusting yourself based on other people's reactions. Authenticity generates energy because you're expressing rather than suppressing, revealing rather than concealing, flowing rather than controlling. Jung understood that authentic expression is actually energizing because it aligns your inner experience with your outer expression. When there's no gap between what you're feeling and what you're expressing, when there's no difference between who you are and who you're being, energy flows naturally rather than being blocked by internal conflict. This energy flow is what Jung called psychological coherence, the experience of being integrated rather than fragmented, whole rather than divided, authentic rather than adapted. Psychological coherence feels like relief, like coming home to yourself, like finally being able to breathe fully. The silent rebellion is about choosing this coherence over the fragmentation that comes from performance. It's about recognizing that the energy you save by not performing is available for creativity, connection, contribution, and joy. It's about understanding that authenticity is not just morally right, but energetically sustainable. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Jung's approach is his understanding that psychological healing isn't about eliminating symptoms, but about changing your relationship to them. You don't heal anxiety by never feeling anxious. You heal anxiety by learning to feel anxious without being consumed by anxiety. You don't heal depression by never feeling sad. You heal depression by learning to feel sad without losing yourself in sadness. This shift from symptom management to relationship transformation is what makes Jung's approach so different from conventional therapy and so challenging for people who want quick fixes. He understood that symptoms aren't just problems to be solved. They're communications from parts of yourself that have been ignored, rejected, or misunderstood. Your anxiety might be trying to tell you that you're moving too fast, taking on too much, or ignoring your intuition. Your depression might be trying to tell you that you're living someone else's life, that you've lost connection to what matters to you, or that you need to grieve something you've been avoiding. Your anger might be trying to tell you that your boundaries have been crossed, that you're not honoring your values, or that you're giving your power away. The silent rebellion involves learning to listen to these communications without immediately trying to silence them. It's about developing the capacity to receive information from your symptoms rather than just trying to eliminate them. This doesn't mean you have to like your symptoms or that you shouldn't work to change them. It means you approach them as messengers rather than enemies. Jung called this approach befriending the symptom, the practice of getting curious about what your symptoms might be trying to accomplish, what they might be protecting you from, or what they might be trying to help you remember. This isn't about romanticizing mental illness or avoiding treatment. It's about adding a layer of psychological sophistication to whatever treatment you're receiving. For example, if you're taking medication for anxiety, befriending the symptom might involve also exploring what your anxiety is trying to tell you about your life, your relationships, or your choices. If you're in therapy for depression, befriending the symptom might involve also examining what your depression might be protecting you from, or what it might be trying to help you slow down and feel. This approach requires what Jung called the symbolic attitude, the ability to see symptoms not just as problems, but as symbols of deeper psychological processes. Your insomnia might symbolize your difficulty with surrender and trust. Your panic attacks might symbolize your fear of losing control. Your chronic fatigue might symbolize your need to rest and restore your energy. The symbolic attitude doesn't replace medical treatment. It adds meaning to medical treatment. It helps you understand not just what's happening in your body and brain, but what might be happening in your psyche and soul. It connects your symptoms to your story, your patterns to your purpose, your problems to your potential. This is particularly important for people who have been in therapy or personal development for years but still feel stuck. Often they've learned to manage their symptoms without ever really understanding what their symptoms are trying to tell them. They've learned coping strategies without ever addressing the underlying psychological dynamics that create the need for so much coping. Jung understood that sustainable healing requires addressing these underlying dynamics, the unconscious beliefs, unresolved conflicts, and disowned aspects of self that create and maintain symptoms. This is deeper work than symptom management, but it's also more lasting. The alchemy of shadow integration is perhaps Jung's most profound contribution to psychology. The shadow, in Jung's understanding, is not just your dark side. It's everything about yourself that you've learned to disown, reject, or deny. For many people, especially those who were taught to be good, the shadow contains not just anger and selfishness, but also confidence, creativity, sexuality, power, and joy. Shadow integration isn't about acting out every impulse or expressing every emotion. It's about bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness so that you can choose how to express it, rather than having it express itself through symptoms, projections, or compulsions. The shadow often expresses itself through what Jung called projection, seeing in others what you can't accept in yourself. If you've disowned your anger, you might be constantly surrounded by angry people or find yourself in conflict with others. If you've disowned your power, you might attract controlling people or find yourself in power struggles. If you've disowned your creativity, you might feel jealous of creative people or critical of artistic expression. Jung understood that what you judge most harshly in others is often what you most need to integrate in yourself. The people who trigger you the most are often showing you aspects of yourself that you've rejected. This doesn't mean you have to like everyone or accept all behavior. It means you can use your reactions as information about your own disowned qualities. For example, if someone's confidence triggers you, it might be because you've disowned your own confidence and learned to be humble or self-effacing instead. The trigger is showing you that you have confidence available to you, but you've learned to reject it as arrogance or showing off. If someone's boundaries trigger you, it might be because you've disowned your own capacity for boundaries and learned to be agreeable or accommodating instead. The trigger is showing you that you have the ability to say no, to protect your energy, to prioritize your needs, but you've learned to reject this capacity as selfish or mean. Shadow integration requires what Jung called moral imagination, the ability to imagine different ways of expressing disowned aspects of yourself without immediately acting them out or immediately rejecting them. It's the capacity to play with possibilities in your imagination before choosing how to embody them in reality. For example, if you've disowned your anger, moral imagination might involve imagining what it would look like to express anger appropriately, to set boundaries, to protect what you value, to say no when you mean no. You can explore these possibilities in your imagination before deciding how to express them in your actual relationships. If you've disowned your sexuality, moral imagination might involve imagining what it would look like to express your sexual nature in healthy, conscious ways. You can explore these possibilities privately before deciding how to embody them in your actual life. The key to shadow integration is developing what Jung called conscious choice around previously unconscious material. When aspects of yourself are in the shadow, they operate unconsciously. They control your behavior, your reactions, your attractions and repulsions without your awareness. When you bring them into consciousness, you gain the power to choose how to express them. This conscious choice is what transforms shadow material from a liability into an asset. Your disowned anger becomes the energy for healthy boundaries. Your disowned power becomes the capacity for leadership and protection. Your disowned sexuality becomes the fuel for creativity and intimacy. Your disowned selfishness becomes the foundation for self-care and self-respect. Jung called this process the redemption of the shadow, the transformation of rejected aspects of self into conscious resources. This redemption requires both courage and compassion. Courage to face what you've been avoiding, and compassion for why you learned to avoid it in the first place. Most people learn to disown aspects of themselves because those aspects were met with rejection, punishment, or abandonment early in their lives. A child who expresses anger might be told they're bad, mean, or unlovable. A child who expresses confidence might be told they're showing off, arrogant, or too big for their britches. A child who expresses sexuality might be shamed, ignored, or even abused. These early experiences teach the child that certain aspects of themselves are dangerous and must be hidden or eliminated. The child learns to reject these aspects not because they're inherently bad, but because expressing them threatened their connection to their caregivers. Shadow integration requires understanding that these early rejections were about the capacity of your caregivers to handle certain energies, not about the inherent value or danger of those energies themselves. Your anger wasn't bad. Your parents couldn't handle it. Your confidence wasn't wrong. Your family felt threatened by it. Your sexuality wasn't shameful. Your culture didn't know how to honor it. This understanding allows you to reclaim these aspects of yourself with compassion for both yourself and your caregivers. You can recognize that they were doing their best with their own conditioning, while also taking responsibility for integrating what you need to integrate for your own wholeness. The process of shadow integration often involves what Jung called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with disowned aspects of yourself to understand their purpose, their pain, and their potential. This might involve journaling from the perspective of your disowned anger, visualizing conversations with your rejected confidence, or imagining what your disowned creativity wants to express. Active imagination allows you to develop a conscious relationship with shadow material rather than being unconsciously controlled by it. When you can dialogue with your anger, you can understand what it's protecting and choose how to express that protection. When you can communicate with your power, you can understand what it wants to create and choose how to use that creative energy. Jung understood that shadow integration is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. As you grow and encounter new situations, new aspects of your shadow may emerge. As you heal certain patterns, deeper layers of rejected material may surface. This is normal and natural. It means you're continuing to grow into your full potential. The alchemy of shadow integration transforms what Jung called the leaden weight of rejection into the gold of self-acceptance. When you stop rejecting aspects of yourself, you stop wasting energy on internal conflict. When you integrate your shadow, you access power, creativity, and aliveness that were previously unavailable to you. This integration is what Jung meant when he said that individuation involves becoming who you really are. You're not becoming someone new. You're reclaiming someone you've always been, but learned to hide. You're not adding to yourself. You're subtracting the barriers that have kept you from accessing your full self. The silent rebellion is ultimately about this integration, the choice to reclaim all parts of yourself, to stop rejecting aspects of your humanity, to become whole rather than just good. It's about recognizing that your completeness includes your contradictions, your fullness includes your shadows, and your authenticity includes everything you've been taught to deny. This integration doesn't happen through force or effort, but through acceptance and curiosity. When you approach your shadow with the same compassion you would offer a wounded friend, it begins to transform naturally. When you listen to your rejected aspects with genuine interest, they begin to reveal their gifts rather than just their defenses. The alchemy of shadow integration is perhaps the most profound work a human being can undertake, because it transforms not just your relationship with yourself, but your relationship with all of life. When you stop rejecting your own darkness, you stop being afraid of darkness in others. When you integrate your own shadow, you stop needing others to carry your projections. This integration contributes to what Jung called the healing of the collective shadow, the reduction of unconscious projection and scapegoating that creates conflict, prejudice, and violence in the world. As individuals integrate their personal shadows, they contribute to the integration of the collective shadow. The silent rebellion is both personal and political, both individual and collective. It's about healing yourself and healing the world, about becoming whole and creating space for others to become whole, about integrating your shadow and contributing to the integration of the human shadow. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Jung's teaching is his understanding that the journey toward wholeness is not a straight line but a spiral. You don't heal something once and then move on. You revisit the same themes at deeper and deeper levels throughout your life. Each time you encounter a familiar pattern, you have the opportunity to meet it with more consciousness, more compassion, and more choice. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of what he called the attitude of the beginner's mind, approaching each moment of your psychological life as if you're encountering it for the first time, even when it feels familiar. Your anger today isn't exactly the same as your anger yesterday, even if it feels similar. Your fear now isn't identical to your fear from last year, even if it seems to be about the same things. The beginner's mind allows you to stay curious about your own psychology, rather than assuming you already know what's happening. It prevents you from collapsing current experiences into past categories. It keeps you available for surprise, for discovery, for growth that doesn't fit your existing understanding of yourself. This is particularly important for people who have been studying psychology or spirituality for years. The more you know about yourself, the easier it becomes to explain your experience rather than actually experiencing it. You can become so good at understanding your patterns that you stop questioning them, so skilled at analyzing your emotions that you stop feeling them. The silent rebellion includes the willingness to not know, to be surprised by yourself, to discover aspects of your personality that don't fit your self-concept. It's the recognition that you are more complex, more mysterious, and more interesting than any story you tell about yourself. Jung called this the mystery of the self. The recognition that no matter how much you understand about yourself, there will always be more to discover. You are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Your depths are not obstacles to overcome, but treasures to explore. This mystery is what makes life worth living and relationships worth having. If you could completely understand yourself and other people, if you could predict all your reactions and control all your responses, life would become unbearably boring. The mystery keeps you engaged, keeps you growing, keeps you alive. The architecture of authentic relationships is built on this foundation of mystery and discovery. Authentic relationships are not about finding someone who fits your requirements or specifications. They're about creating space for two people to be themselves fully, while learning to navigate the complexities that arise when two complete humans attempt to share life together. Most people approach relationships from what Jung called the marketplace mentality, the belief that you need to present your best self to attract love, that you must hide your difficulties to maintain love, and that relationships are fundamentally about getting your needs met by another person. This mentality creates what Jung called provisional relationships, connections where both people are performing versions of themselves rather than revealing themselves. Provisional relationships feel safe because they're controllable. When you're performing a version of yourself, you can manage the other person's reactions to some degree. When you're hiding your difficulties, you can avoid conflict and criticism. When you're focused on getting your needs met, you can measure the success of the relationship by how satisfied you feel. But Jung understood that provisional relationships are ultimately unsatisfying because they're based on images rather than realities. You end up feeling loved for who you're pretending to be rather than who you actually are. You end up trying to maintain a performance that becomes increasingly exhausting over time. You end up feeling lonely, even when you're with someone, because they're in relationship with your persona rather than your person. The silent rebellion in relationships involves moving from provisional connections to what Jung called authentic encounters, interactions where both people are willing to be real rather than right, vulnerable rather than perfect, curious rather than certain. Authentic encounters require what Jung called the courage of revelation, the willingness to let another person see you as you actually are, including your difficulties, your contradictions, your growing edges, and your shadows. This courage develops gradually, through small acts of vulnerability that help you discover whether the other person can handle your reality. The courage of revelation is different from emotional dumping or oversharing. It's not about telling everyone everything or using vulnerability as a strategy to create intimacy. It's about being genuinely yourself in relationships and allowing others to decide whether they want to engage with your authentic self or prefer your performed self. This authenticity often reveals what Jung called relationship compatibility, the degree to which two people can handle each other's realities without trying to change each other or themselves. Compatibility isn't about having the same interests or values. It's about having the emotional capacity to stay present with each other's full humanity. Some people can handle your intensity, others find it overwhelming. Some people appreciate your sensitivity, others see it as weakness. Some people enjoy your complexity, others prefer simplicity. These differences aren't anyone's fault. They're just information about compatibility. The architecture of authentic relationships includes what Jung called differentiated intimacy, the ability to be close to someone without losing yourself, to be influenced by someone without being controlled by them, to care about someone without being responsible for their emotional state. Differentiated intimacy requires clear boundaries, not walls that keep people out, but membranes that allow connection while preserving individual identity. You can love someone deeply while also disagreeing with their choices. You can support someone's growth while also not taking responsibility for their growth. You can be emotionally available without being emotionally enmeshed. Many people struggle with differentiated intimacy because they learned early that love requires sacrifice of self, that caring means taking responsibility for others' feelings, that intimacy means agreement and similarity. These beliefs create what Jung called fused relationships, connections where both people lose their individual identity in service of the relationship. Fused relationships feel intense and can be mistaken for deep love, but they're actually based on mutual dependency rather than mutual choice. When you're fused with someone, their emotions become your emotions, their problems become your problems, their choices become your choices. This creates a temporary sense of unity, but it ultimately leads to resentment and loss of individual vitality. The silent rebellion in relationships involves learning to love people without losing yourself, to care without caretaking, to be intimate without being enmeshed. This requires developing what Jung called emotional sovereignty, the recognition that you are responsible for your own emotional state and others are responsible for theirs. Emotional sovereignty doesn't mean being cold or unfeeling. It means being able to feel your own feelings while also being present for others' feelings without taking them on as your own. You can feel compassion for someone's pain without making their pain your pain. You can offer support without taking responsibility for outcomes. This sovereignty is particularly challenging for people who learn to be caregivers, helpers, or fixers in their families of origin. These are people who learned that their value came from being useful to others, that love meant sacrificing their own needs, that peace required managing everyone else's emotions. Breaking the caretaking pattern requires what Jung called the recovery of selfish love, learning to prioritize your own emotional well-being, not because you don't care about others, but because you can't genuinely care for others when you're depleted, resentful, or running on empty. Selfish love, in Jung's understanding, is not about being inconsiderate or self-centered. It's about loving yourself enough to maintain your own emotional center, to honor your own needs, to set boundaries that preserve your capacity to love authentically rather than compulsively. The architecture of authentic relationships also includes what Jung called conflict as connection, the understanding that disagreement, tension, and friction are natural parts of any real relationship. When two complete people with different histories, different needs, and different perspectives attempt to share life, conflict is inevitable. Most people try to avoid conflict because they learned that conflict means danger, loss of love, abandonment, rejection, or emotional violence. But Jung understood that the attempt to avoid conflict actually creates more problems than conflict itself. When you avoid addressing differences, they don't disappear. They go underground and express themselves through passive aggression, resentment, and emotional distance. Conflict as connection requires learning to disagree without demonizing, to express frustration without attacking, to protect your needs without destroying the relationship. This requires what Jung called fighting fairly, the ability to engage in conflict in ways that preserve the humanity and dignity of both people. Fighting fairly involves focusing on specific behaviors rather than attacking character, expressing your own feelings rather than analyzing the other person's motivations, and seeking understanding rather than winning. It means being able to say, "I'm angry about what happened," rather than "you're a terrible person." It means being able to express your needs without making the other person wrong for having different needs. The development of fair fighting skills often requires healing from family of origin patterns, where conflict was either completely avoided or expressed through emotional violence. Many people learned that conflict means someone has to be right, and someone has to be wrong, that expressing anger means being cruel, that disagreeing means not loving. Jung understood that these early learning experiences create what he called conflict phobia, the fear that any expression of difference or frustration will destroy relationships. This phobia keeps people stuck in superficial connections, where real issues are never addressed and real intimacy is never achieved. The silent rebellion in relationships involves developing the courage to engage in conflict constructively, to express differences respectfully, to address problems directly rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves. This courage develops through practice, through small experiments in honest communication that help you discover that relationships can actually become stronger through navigating differences together. Authentic relationships also require what Jung called the tolerance for imperfection, the recognition that both you and your partner are human beings in process rather than finished products. This means accepting that both of you will make mistakes, have bad days, act unconsciously sometimes, and continue growing throughout the relationship. The tolerance for imperfection is different from settling or accepting mistreatment. It's about distinguishing between character flaws that are deal breakers and human limitations that are workable. Everyone has growing edges, blind spots, and areas where they're still developing. The question is whether both people are committed to growth and whether the relationship supports that growth. This tolerance requires giving up what Jung called the perfect partner fantasy, the belief that there's someone out there who will meet all your needs, never trigger your insecurities, always understand you, and require no work or compromise. This fantasy keeps people either endlessly searching for someone who doesn't exist or trying to mold their current partner into an impossible ideal. The perfect partner fantasy is often a defense against the vulnerability required for real intimacy. It's easier to blame relationship problems on having the wrong partner than to do the work of learning to love an actual human being with actual limitations and complexities. Jung understood that mature love is not about finding the right person, but about becoming the right person, developing the emotional skills, the self-awareness, and the commitment to growth that allow you to love someone authentically rather than conditionally. The architecture of authentic relationships ultimately rests on what Jung called mutual individuation, the commitment to supporting each other's growth into wholeness rather than trying to keep each other the same, to maintain comfort and predictability. Mutual individuation means celebrating your partner's growth even when it means they're becoming different from who they were when you met them. It means supporting their dreams even when their dreams don't include you in the way you'd prefer. It means loving them for who they're becoming rather than just who they've been. This level of love requires tremendous emotional maturity because it asks you to love someone's highest good even when their highest good creates inconvenience, challenge, or uncertainty for you. It asks you to want their wholeness, even when their wholeness triggers your insecurities. But Jung understood that this is the only kind of love that actually lasts, because it's based on reality rather than fantasy, on acceptance rather than control, on choice rather than need. When both people are committed to their own growth and their partner's growth, the relationship becomes a container for mutual transformation rather than mutual limitation. The silent rebellion in relationships is about choosing this kind of love. Love that supports authenticity rather than performance, growth rather than stagnation, truth rather than comfort. It's about creating relationships that call forth your best self rather than your adapted self, that challenge you to grow rather than allowing you to hide. The integration of Jung's insights into daily life requires what he called the practice of conscious living, the ongoing choice to bring awareness to the unconscious patterns that normally run your life automatically. This isn't about becoming hyper-vigilant or obsessively self-aware. It's about developing a friendly curiosity about your own psychology and a willingness to question your assumptions about yourself and others. Conscious living means noticing when you're projecting your own unresolved issues onto other people, rather than dealing with them directly. It means recognizing when you're avoiding difficult emotions by staying busy, when you're using spiritual concepts to bypass psychological realities, when you're performing growth rather than actually growing. Most importantly, conscious living means developing the capacity to choose your responses rather than just reacting from conditioned patterns. This doesn't mean you never react emotionally. It means you create space between your emotional reactions and your behavioral responses. You can feel angry without immediately acting angry. You can feel afraid without immediately avoiding. You can feel sad without immediately trying to fix the sadness. This space between feeling and action is where freedom lives. It's where you get to choose who you want to be in each moment, rather than just being who you've always been. It's where you can respond from your wisdom, rather than just your wounds, from your love, rather than just your fear, from your authenticity, rather than just your adaptations. Creating this space requires what Jung called the practice of the pause, the habit of taking a breath before speaking, a moment before acting, a beat before reacting. The pause doesn't have to be long, it just has to be conscious. It's the difference between automatic and intentional, between unconscious and conscious, between reactive and responsive. The pause is particularly important in relationships, where most people operate from unconscious patterns learned in childhood. You might find yourself automatically trying to please people when you feel threatened, automatically withdrawing when you feel criticized, automatically attacking when you feel vulnerable. The pause gives you the opportunity to notice these patterns and choose different responses. For example, if someone criticizes you and you notice yourself automatically getting defensive, the pause allows you to ask, what am I defending? What am I afraid of? What would happen if I listened to this feedback without immediately rejecting it? This doesn't mean you have to accept all criticism. It means you can choose how to respond to it rather than just reacting from your conditioning. If someone asks something of you and you notice yourself automatically saying yes when you want to say no, the pause allows you to ask, what am I afraid will happen if I say no? What do I actually want to do? How can I respond honestly while still being kind? This gives you the opportunity to set boundaries from a place of self-respect rather than self-protection. The practice of the pause extends beyond relationships to all areas of life. When you feel anxious, instead of immediately trying to eliminate the anxiety, you can pause and ask, what is this anxiety trying to tell me? What do I need right now? How can I take care of myself without making this feeling wrong? When you feel stuck in a decision, instead of immediately trying to figure out the right choice, you can pause and ask, what am I afraid of in each option? What do I value most in this situation? What would I choose if I weren't afraid of making a mistake? When you notice yourself falling into old patterns, instead of immediately judging yourself for not being more evolved, you can pause and ask, what triggered this pattern? What need is it trying to meet? How can I meet that need in a more conscious way? The pause isn't about having perfect responses. It's about having conscious responses. It's about bringing awareness to your automatic patterns so that you can choose whether to continue them or try something different. Sometimes you'll still choose the same response, but you'll choose it consciously rather than unconsciously. Jung understood that consciousness is not a destination, but a practice. You don't become conscious once and stay that way. You choose Consciousness moment by moment, decision by decision, relationship by relationship. Sometimes you'll be more conscious, sometimes less. Sometimes you'll remember to pause, sometimes you'll forget. This is normal and human. The goal isn't to be perfectly conscious all the time. The goal is to gradually increase your capacity for consciousness over time. It's like developing a muscle. The more you practice, the stronger it becomes, but you have to keep practicing to maintain the strength. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of what he called the daily practice. Small, consistent choices to bring consciousness to your life rather than waiting for dramatic transformations or peak experiences. The daily practice might be as simple as taking 3 conscious breaths before getting out of bed, pausing before checking your phone, or asking yourself, what do I actually want, before automatically saying yes to requests. The daily practice is about finding small moments throughout your day to reconnect with yourself, to check in with your body, to notice your emotional state, to remember your values. These moments don't have to be long or elaborate, they just have to be conscious. Jung called this the sacrament of the ordinary, the recognition that consciousness can be cultivated through the most mundane activities. Washing dishes can become a meditation on presence. Walking can become a practice of embodiment. Eating can become an exercise in gratitude and awareness. The sacrament of the ordinary is particularly powerful for people who think they need special circumstances to practice consciousness. More time, less stress, better relationships, different jobs. Jung understood that consciousness is available in whatever circumstances you're in right now. You don't need to change your life to practice consciousness. You need to practice consciousness to change your life. This approach is both humble and radical. It's humble because it doesn't require you to be special or have special experiences. It's radical because it suggests that ordinary life is already sacred, that your current circumstances are already workable, that you already have everything you need to begin. The silent rebellion includes this recognition that you don't need to wait for better conditions to start living consciously. You don't need to heal all your trauma before you can be present. You don't need to resolve all your patterns before you can make conscious choices. You can begin right now, right here with whatever capacity you have. The daily practice also includes what Jung called emotional hygiene, regular practices to clear accumulated emotional residue, process daily experiences, and maintain psychological balance. Just as you brush your teeth to maintain physical health, you need practices to maintain emotional health. Emotional hygiene might include journaling to process daily experiences, meditation to calm your nervous system, time in nature to restore your energy, creative expression to release emotions, or physical movement to discharge tension. The specific practices matter less than the consistency and the intention to care for your emotional well-being. Many people neglect emotional hygiene because they don't realize that emotions, like toxins, can accumulate in your system and create problems over time. You might absorb stress from your work environment, take on worry from family members, or carry frustration from traffic or other daily irritations. Without regular emotional clearing, these accumulations can create anxiety, depression, irritability, or physical symptoms. Jung understood that emotional hygiene is not selfish, but necessary for your ability to show up fully in your relationships and responsibilities. When you're emotionally clear, you have more capacity for presence, creativity, and genuine service to others. When you're emotionally congested, you're operating from depletion and are more likely to react unconsciously. The practice of emotional hygiene also includes what Jung called energy management, becoming conscious of what activities, relationships, and environments drain your energy versus what restores your energy. This awareness allows you to make conscious choices about how you spend your time and energy, rather than just following external demands or expectations. Energy management requires developing what Jung called the right to say no, the recognition that your energy is a finite resource that needs to be protected and allocated consciously. This might mean saying no to social obligations when you need time to recharge, setting limits on how much emotional support you provide to others, or choosing to spend time with people who energize you rather than drain you. The right to say No is particularly challenging for people who learned that their value depends on being helpful, available, or agreeable. But Jung understood that saying no to some things is what makes it possible to say yes to the things that really matter. Without boundaries around your energy, you become unavailable for your own life and your genuine contributions to others. Energy management also includes recognizing your natural rhythms and honoring them, rather than trying to force yourself into productivity patterns that don't suit your temperament or circumstances. Some people are naturally more energetic in the morning. Others come alive in the evening. Some people need more solitude to recharge. Others gain energy from social interaction. Jung called this constitutional awareness, understanding your own psychological and physical constitution, rather than trying to conform to external standards of how you should function. Constitutional awareness allows you to work with your nature rather than against it, to optimize your life for your actual needs rather than imagined shoulds. The daily practice of psychological freedom includes what Jung called reality testing, regularly checking whether your perceptions, assumptions, and reactions are based on current reality or historical conditioning. This involves asking questions like, is this person actually rejecting me, or am I projecting rejection based on past experiences? Is this situation actually dangerous, or am I responding from old fears? Am I reacting to what's happening now or to what happened before? Reality testing helps you distinguish between appropriate responses to current situations and inappropriate responses based on unresolved past experiences. When you can make this distinction, you can respond more accurately and effectively to what's actually happening, rather than to what you imagine is happening based on your history. This practice is particularly important for people who experienced trauma, abuse, or chronic stress in their early lives. These experiences can create hypervigilance, a tendency to perceive danger even in safe situations, to expect rejection even from accepting people, to anticipate criticism even from supportive friends. Hypervigilance was an intelligent adaptation to genuinely dangerous or unpredictable environments. But when you're no longer in those environments, hypervigilance can create problems in relationships and prevent you from recognizing safety and love when they're actually present. Reality testing involves gently questioning your initial reactions and gathering more information before responding. If you feel rejected by someone's tone of voice, you might ask, are you feeling distant from me? Or am I just interpreting your tone through my own sensitivity? If you feel criticized by someone's feedback, you might ask, can you help me understand what you're trying to communicate? I want to make sure I'm hearing you accurately. This kind of reality testing requires vulnerability because it involves admitting that your perceptions might not be accurate, that your reactions might be based on your own issues rather than the other person's behavior. But Jung understood that this vulnerability is actually a sign of strength. The strength to remain curious rather than defensive, to seek understanding rather than to be right. The daily practice also includes what Jung called intentional living, making conscious choices about how you want to spend your time, energy, and attention, rather than just responding to external demands or following automatic patterns. Intentional living means regularly asking, what do I actually want to do with my life? What matters most to me? How do I want to spend my time today? These questions might seem simple, but they're revolutionary for people who have spent years living according to other people's expectations, cultural pressures, or unconscious patterns. Many people reach midlife and realize they've been living someone else's life, pursuing goals they don't actually want, maintaining relationships that don't fulfill them, spending their time on activities that don't energize them. Intentional living requires developing what Jung called the courage to disappoint, the willingness to make choices that might disappoint others but align with your authentic values and desires. This might mean changing careers even though your family has expectations about your success, ending relationships that aren't working even though breakups are painful, or choosing a simpler lifestyle even though the culture values achievement and accumulation. The courage to disappoint is particularly challenging for people who learned that love is conditional on meeting others' expectations. But Jung understood that the alternative, living your entire life to avoid disappointing others, is a form of slow suicide. You gradually disappear as an individual in service of maintaining connections that aren't based on who you actually are. Intentional living also includes what Jung called value clarification, becoming clear about what actually matters to you rather than what you think should matter to you. This involves examining the values you inherited from your family, culture, and education to determine which ones are authentic to you and which ones you've accepted without question. Value clarification might involve asking, do I actually value achievement? Or was I taught that achievement is important? Do I actually want a traditional relationship? Or am I following cultural expectations? Do I actually enjoy social activities? Or do I participate because I think I should? This examination can be uncomfortable because it might reveal that you've been living according to values that aren't actually yours. You might discover that you don't care as much about financial success as you thought you did, that you value creativity more than security, that you prefer solitude to social activity, or that you're more interested in meaning than material accumulation. But Jung understood that this discomfort is the price of authenticity. You can't live authentically without knowing what's authentic to you. You can't make conscious choices without being conscious of what you actually value rather than what you think you should value. The daily practice of psychological freedom ultimately creates what Jung called a life worth living, a life that reflects your authentic values, honors your genuine needs, expresses your real talents, and contributes to something larger than yourself. This isn't about perfection or having everything figured out. It's about living with consciousness, authenticity, and intention rather than just reacting to circumstances or following unconscious patterns. Jung understood that a life worth living is not necessarily an easy life or a comfortable life. It's a life where you're awake to your own experience, where you're making conscious choices, where you're growing into your full potential rather than settling for a diminished version of yourself. The silent rebellion is about claiming this. It's a kind of life for yourself, not because you deserve better than other people, but because consciousness and authenticity are your birthright as a human being. You came into this world with unique gifts, perspectives, and contributions. The daily practice of psychological freedom is about removing the barriers that prevent you from expressing these gifts fully. This practice doesn't require dramatic changes or heroic gestures. It requires the consistent choice to bring consciousness to your daily experience, to pause before reacting, to question your assumptions, to honor your authentic needs, and to make choices based on who you're becoming, rather than who you've always been. The revolution begins with these small daily choices. It begins with the decision to breathe before speaking, to ask for what you need, to say no when you mean no, to feel your emotions without immediately trying to fix them, to be curious rather than certain, to remain open to growth even when growth is uncomfortable. Jung believed that individual consciousness contributes to collective consciousness, that personal healing contributes to global healing, that your decision to live authentically gives others permission to live authentically. The daily practice of psychological freedom is not just personal development. It's a contribution to the evolution of human consciousness. Every moment you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, authenticity over performance, love over fear, you're participating in what Jung called the great work, the ongoing project of human awakening. You're not just changing your own life, you're contributing to the possibility that all human beings can live with greater consciousness, authenticity, and freedom. Conclusion: the quiet revolution continues. As we reach the end of this exploration into the depths of psychological liberation, it's important to recognize that endings are also beginnings. Jung understood that individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, is not a destination, but a direction, not an achievement, but a way of traveling through life. The silent rebellion we've been exploring is not something you complete, but something you embody. Not a problem you solve, but a practice you live. It's the ongoing choice to remain conscious in an unconscious world, to stay authentic in a culture that rewards performance, to keep growing in environments that encourage stagnation. This rebellion is called silent, not because it's passive or hidden, but because it happens in the space between thoughts, in the pause before reactions, in the moment of choice that exists between stimulus and response. It's the revolution that occurs when you stop waiting for external permission to be who you are, and start giving yourself that permission, moment by moment, breath by breath. The work we've explored, shadow integration, authentic relationships, conscious living, emotional sovereignty, is not work you do once and then move on. It's work you do daily, in small ways and large ways, in ordinary moments and extraordinary circumstances. It's the work of being human in the fullest sense of what that means. Jung understood that this work is both intensely personal and deeply collective. As you heal your own splits between authentic self and adapted self, you contribute to healing the collective split between who we are and who we think we should be. As you integrate your own shadow projections, you contribute to reducing the unconscious projections that create conflict in families, communities, and nations. The ripple effects of individual consciousness are impossible to measure but undeniable in their impact. When you stop trying to get love through performance and start expressing love through authenticity, you change the emotional field around you. When you stop projecting your unhealed wounds onto others and start taking responsibility for your own healing, you create space for others to do the same. The silent rebellion is ultimately about remembering what Jung called the essential dignity of human consciousness, the recognition that your capacity for awareness, choice, and growth is not a luxury but a responsibility, not a privilege but a purpose. This dignity includes your right to exist as you are without apology or explanation. It includes your responsibility to develop your consciousness for the benefit of all life. It includes your capacity to transform suffering into wisdom, wounds, into gifts, patterns into choices. The world needs what you came here to give, but it needs it in your authentic form, not in the sanitized, socially acceptable version you've been performing. It needs your real voice, not the voice you think people want to hear. It needs your genuine presence, not the persona you've constructed to keep yourself safe. Your sensitivity is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be honored. Your intensity is not too much for the world, but exactly what the world needs from someone willing to feel deeply in a culture that encourages emotional numbness. Your complexity is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be offered. The silent rebellion continues in your willingness to honor these truths about yourself, to express them even when they're misunderstood, to live them even when they're not applauded. It continues in your choice to be real rather than right, vulnerable rather than perfect, growing rather than finished. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of human development is what he called the realization of the self, not the ego self that seeks approval and avoids rejection, but the authentic self that exists beneath all conditioning, adaptation, and performance. This self is not something you create, but something you uncover, not something you achieve, but something you remember. The process of uncovering this authentic self is what we've been calling the silent rebellion. It's the choice to stop rebelling against who you are and start rebelling against who you think you should be. It's the decision to stop fighting your nature and start expressing it consciously. It's the commitment to stop performing your life and start living it. This rebellion requires courage, the courage to disappoint people who prefer your adapted self, the courage to feel emotions you've been taught to suppress, the courage to express aspects of yourself you've learned to hide. But it also requires gentleness with yourself as you unlearn patterns that no longer serve you, gentleness with others as they adjust to your authenticity, gentleness with the process of becoming who you are. The balance of courage and gentleness is what creates lasting transformation rather than dramatic but temporary change. Jung understood that sustainable growth happens through consistent choices rather than peak experiences, through daily practice rather than weekend workshops, through living differently rather than just thinking differently. The silent rebellion is available to you in this moment, not because you've completed some preparation or achieved some level of worthiness, but because consciousness is your birthright and authenticity is your natural state. You don't need to earn the right to be yourself. You need to claim it. This claiming happens in small ways and large ways, in private moments and public interactions, in the relationships you choose and the boundaries you set, in the work you do and the rest you take, in the words you speak and the silence you maintain. As you continue this journey of conscious living, remember that you're not alone. You're part of a quiet revolution of people who are choosing consciousness over unconsciousness, authenticity over performance, love over fear. You may not see them all, but they're there. In your neighborhood, in your workplace, in your family, around the world. This revolution doesn't need leaders or organizations, manifestos or movements. It needs individuals who are willing to be real, to grow, to love authentically, to live consciously. It needs people like you who are willing to do the work of becoming who they really are beneath who they've learned to be. The work continues. The rebellion continues. The journey toward wholeness continues. It continues in your next breath, your next choice, your next moment of consciousness. It continues in your willingness to be exactly who you are, right here, right now, without apology or explanation. Welcome to the silent rebellion. Welcome to the quiet revolution. Welcome to the ongoing adventure of becoming authentically, unapologetically, consciously yourself. The world is waiting for what only you can give. Your time is now. Your moment is here. Your rebellion begins with this breath, this choice, this decision to be real in a world that profits from your performance. Take this with you. You are already whole, already worthy, already enough. The work is not to become these things, but to remember them, not to achieve them, but to recognize them, not to earn them, but to embody them. The silent rebellion has begun. It begins with you. It begins now.